Last week, we were in Hebrews chapter 6, and I would say that's probably one of the most difficult passages in our entire Bible. Like, it's probably top 5 most challenging passages to kind of work through, kind of looking at. Some people think, like, can we lose our salvation? And what I kind of unpacked was like, no, you cannot lose your salvation because you cannot lose what you did not earn, right? Jesus has done something for you. And it's incredible. Now today, as hard as chapter 6 was, today's not much easier. So I hope you brought your thinking caps, and it is a challenging passage where we're gonna look at the superiority of Jesus as our high priest. It's the superiority of the priesthood of Jesus. Now, in order to kind of give you a little bit of idea, why is that important? It doesn't seem to be all that important. Does it really matter that Jesus is our high priest? Here's the kind of angle that I want to go at it this morning. One, many of you, if you've been around at any length, I am a very competitive person, right? I love people, I want to include you, but anything where I include you on, I want to beat you. Right? I'm just competitive, right? I'm always competing. I'm competing against myself. I'm competing against others. Sometimes I'm competing against people and they don't even know I'm competing against them. I shared an example. I mean, I could share numerous examples, but it just reminded me. I remember a few years ago, I was kind of in the habit of swimming. I am not a swimmer. I wasn't on any swim team. I'm not Michael Phelps. But I'm more like Alexander Popov. Remember him, the Russian rocket? I thought, you know what, I can swim pretty good. And so I was kind of practicing. I even mastered the flip turn. That's right. I could flip and then start swimming. So I was kind of, in a few weeks, feeling really good about myself in the pool. And I remember, like, I was just about ready to get in the pool. Another gentleman walked in and I was like, yeah, he's my competition today. And he was kind of he was a short man. He was an older man. And quite frankly, he was just a bit plump, right? He was portly. And I was like, I am going to whoop him in the pool. And I got in my lane, he got in his lane, and we start swimming, and he destroyed me. I mean, it was just like, I remember just kind of like getting out of the pool and just chuckling to myself, like, this guy humiliated me. He didn't even know he humiliated me. And the reason I bring that up is, like, I overestimated my swimming skills. And the reality is, so often we overestimate our ability, especially when it comes to standing before God. We are not as good and righteous and as talented as we might think. And so we need a mediator. We need a high priest who is going to stand in the gap. And Jesus, he is our high priest, and we get to see what that looks like today. So, if you have your Bibles, Hebrews 7. Now, Hebrews 5, which was 2 weeks ago, if you were with us, we looked at the qualifications of the priesthood. The author of Hebrews is saying, there are 2 qualifications to be a priest, without exception, right? You have to be called by God, and you have to be sympathetic. That's what chapter 5 is about. Meaning, you have to be called by God. You didn't host a campaign in order to be high priest. You didn't apply for the position, right? God is the one who called the priest. He chose who his high priest were going to be. Now, in the Old Testament, how did he do that? He did it by lineage, meaning you had to come from a certain person, a certain tribe. You had to come from the tribe of Levi. Right? Jacob had 12 sons, and of those 12 sons, one of them was Levi. You had to come from his lineage. So it didn't matter if you're like, oh, but I'm a son from the tribe of Dan, and I just really wanted to be a priest. Sorry, disqualified. You don't get to be priest. You have to be from Levi. Now, some of you during that week, you're thinking, wait a second. You saying Jesus is going to be our high priest? He can't be. I didn't address it then because I didn't need to address it then. But some of you are like, how can Jesus be a high priest? We have a problem. Why can't Jesus be our high priest? Because he's not from Levi. He's from a different tribe. He's from the tribe of Judah. Which means if you were like kind of an Orthodox Jew, you would say, I'm sorry, he can't be our priest. He has to come from Levi. And the author of Hebrews saying, au contraire, I will show you how he can be a high priest. He's actually of a higher priesthood. He's from a different priesthood, a greater priesthood. That's what he's going to show us. And this greater priesthood is not just some concoction that he made up on his own. Right? He's not all of a sudden like, oh, he's just kind of, oh man, he's sharp and he's just being creative and starting a whole new things. What he's going to show us, he's just given us an Old Testament Bible study to show us that this is fact the case. We have a better priest in Jesus. So, what does that look like? He's going to be of a priesthood, a Melchizedekian priest. He's not a Levitical priest from Levi. He's a Melchizedekian priest. And so what does that mean? And that's what he tries, like, that's kind of how he ends chapter 5. He's like, I want to talk to you about how Jesus is a Melchizedekian priest, but I can't because you're still babies. You're still nursing on milk. You should be teaching, but now you're actually like, you're still babies. And so, let's jump in. Look at chapter 7, verse 1. You're going to see Jesus, the Melchizedek is just you're going to see the significance of Melchizedek. He's a shadow. He's a type. He's a forerunner, if you will. And I'll unpack that, what that means. Verse 1, look. For this Melchizedek, king of Salem, priest of the Most High God, met Abraham returning from the slaughter of the kings and blessed him. Right here, we're seeing this introduction now of who is this Melchizedek. And you'll notice, just right off in verse 1, Melchizedek is an individual who is both king and priest. He holds both offices. Now, if you know your Old Testament, some of us do, some of us don't, and that's okay. In the Old Testament, God separated the powers between the king and the priest. No individual was both king and priest. Why would God do that? Because God knows that you had to separate the power, right? You've heard the statement, absolute power, what? Corrupts absolutely. And so God would separate, there was kings, there was priests. You did not have both. But this individual is the first individual we see in our Bible who is both king and priest. He's both. Now, who is this Melchizedek? You have to go all the way back. You're like, Melchizedek who? Melchizedek what? You have to go all the way back to Genesis 14. He appears during the time of Abraham. During Genesis 14, if you remember, Abraham's nephew, Lot, gets basically kidnapped by a bunch of raiders. And Abraham hears of it, and he goes to rescue Lot. He grabs some allies of his, and he rescues Lot. And not only does he take down the enemy, he comes back with Lot and with plunder, with spoils. God blessed him. And after that victory of being not just rescuing Lot, but having the spoils of the plunder, he meets Melchizedek. Now, what happens? Well, you can read Genesis 14, but it tells us also right here. Verse 2, and to him, Abraham apportioned a 10th part of everything. He is the first, by translation of his name, King of Righteousness. And he is also the king of Salem. And so right here we see a number of things that after this victory, Abraham now gives Melchizedek a tenth, a tithe of his spoils. Now, Melchizedek is also, notice, he is also at this time, he's a monotheist. He is the worshiper of El Elyon. He is the worshiper of God Most High. He is the one, he has not been impacted by pagan idols, pagan ideology. He is the worshiper of the one true God. He hasn't been influenced by the perversion of Sodom and Gomorrah. He is a king that says, what kind of king is? He's a righteous king. What kind of a priest is he? He is a priest who brings peace. He's king and priest, but he's also righteous and peace in him. And so we see this individual. He is a great man. And what you're going to see now, though, from the author of Hebrews, is that here is this individual, Melchizedek. He has no beginning of days, and he has no end of life. Look at it. It's like he just appears on the scene. It's like all of a sudden he's just here. Who is this guy? We don't know anything about him. Look at verse 3. Melchizedek, he is without father or mother or genealogy, having neither beginning of days nor end of life. But resembling the Son of God, he continues a priest forever, right? We don't know, like all of a sudden, here's this guy, he appears. And now the author says he has no beginning of days, no father, no mother, no end of life, right? It's like, have you ever seen the show Finding Your Roots with Henry Louis Gates Jr., right? A fun show, like PB. All right, fine. It's a show actually on TV, right? You can trace the people's lineage. He's not a candidate. No father, no mother. What kind of person has no father, no mother, no genealogy, right? The answer is really quite simple. You have to be divine, right? Only God can claim this. Only God is qualified by this. Now follow me here. Now, does the text tell us and state that Melchizedek is God? Be careful. Be careful. Does it say that Melchizedek is God? It does not. It doesn't say he's God, right? And so there are individuals, I would say there are some pastors, some theologians that actually do believe that this Melchizedek is actually the pre-incarnate Christ, meaning that they believe that this is Jesus in the Old Testament. Now, I do believe that there are places where you can actually see Jesus in the Old Testament. That's another sermon for another day. But, right, do I believe that Melchizedek is God? No, because there's one word in this passage that to me eliminates that it's God. What's the word in verse 3? Resembling. Resembling. Some translations say made like. This Melchizedek is resembling the Son of God. He's made like the Son of God. So what is he trying to communicate? Here's what I think the author of Hebrews is trying to show us. The author of Hebrews, I believe, is using a literary tool to communicate a very important truth. He's using a literary device to communicate a higher reality or truth, right? In other words, the author likens Melchizedek to Jesus with a literary device. So here's what I would say. Melchizedek is not literally divine. He's not God, but he's literarily depicted as divine. He's being shown like to be like God. Because remember, Genesis, if you read Genesis is all about the generations and genealogy. You read Genesis, and it's like, this are the generations of Adam, and this is the generation of Shem and Seth, and this is the generation of Noah, and the generations of Ham, Japheth, and so on. This is the lineage of Abraham. And all of a sudden, here's Melchizedek, and he doesn't have any generations. He doesn't have like a father or mother being described. And so he is like, literally like the Son of God. How so? Because he's both king and priest. He is both righteous and peace. There's peace. He appears to be eternal. He looks like he's divine, but he's resembling Christ. In other words, like in verse 3, he will continue like it's a perpetual priesthood. So, how many Melchizedekian priests are there? Let's just say it's a short roll call. There is one, because it's permanent. It's perpetual. It continues to go on. What you see is the type and the antitype, right? Melchizedek is just a shadow. He's just the type. Jesus is actually the antitype. Now, that language can be a little bit confusing, so I'll say it in other ways. Melchizedek is foreshadowed. He's the shadow. Jesus is the substance. Melchizedek is the little figurine. And Jesus is what? He is the fulfillment of that. It's been realized in Jesus. Right? That's what the author is showing us. Right? Jesus is a Melchizedekian priest. Right? But so not only do we see in the first 3 verses this idea, like Melchizedek is just a shadow. He's just foreshadowing someone who is to come. He is a figurine. He is a type. But he goes on. Look what the author does. Not only is there a shadow, look at this guy is special. There's a superiority of Melchizedek, meaning this guy is marvelous. He's wonderful. He's not God, but he is special. And he is unique. In fact, what the author is going to show us, he's greater than Abraham. Right? You see verse 4? See how great this man was. See how great this man was, to whom Abraham, the patriarch, gave 1/10 of the spoils. Now the author is going to show you, I want you to see that he is greater than Abraham. And if he's greater than Abraham, he is greater than those who come from Levi. He is greater than the Levitical priest. How do we know that he's greater than Abraham? Well, the author has already said it in verse 4. He gave 1/10 of the spoils to Melchizedek. He's saying, we know that Melchizedek is greater than the patriarch of the faith. He is greater than Abraham because Abraham gave him 1/10 of his spoils. But keep going, verse 5. And those descendants of Levi who received the priestly office have a commandment in the law to take tithes from the people, that is, from their brothers, though these also are descended from Abraham. So you read throughout the Old Testament, and there was a command by God. The command by God was that the people of Israel, the nation of Israel, were to give a portion of their wealth, 1/10 of their wealth, to who? To the priests. Do you remember, like when there's 12 tribes, right, that came from Jacob? God gave 11 of those 12 tribes land. They all got land except one tribe, namely the Levites. God didn't give them a section of land. You know what God did? God says, you all 11, you get the land. And what he did, he took the Levites and just sprinkled them throughout the land. so that the people always had a pastor or a shepherd within walking distance to make sure that they were never going to stray from him. They were the spiritual pastors, the leaders. So God didn't give these Levites land. So how did they survive? The people that got land. There was a commandment. You will support the pastor. You pay the pastor. Praise God. Amen. I'm just saying. All right, that's not my message today, but I'm just saying. All right, there was a command. All these priests came from Abraham. Now on verse 6, look what happens. But this man who does not have his descent from them received tithes from Abraham and blessed him who had the promises. Do you see what this author is doing? He's saying, you know what? Melchizedek, he doesn't come from Abraham. Melchizedek is not of the lineage of Abraham. And yet, right, Abraham is actually paying him. There was no command saying that Abraham had to pay him. There was no command to give to Melchizedek, and yet Abraham willingly gave to him. And it goes even one step further. God didn't say, hey, give to Melchizedek. Well, he did, but you also see something else from the last verse, verse 6. And Abraham, and he blessed him who had the promises, meaning Melchizedek blessed Abraham. In the book of Genesis, you know what you see? You always see the greater blessing the lesser. The father is always going to bless the son. Right here, not only do you see Abraham giving tithes to Melchizedek, you see now the blessing coming from Melchizedek to Abraham. It was a clear inference. Verse 7, it is beyond dispute that the inferior, meaning lesser, is going to be blessed by the superior, the greater. The lesser, i.e. Abraham, is blessed by the greater, i.e. Melchizedek. That's why in verse 4, do you see why the author says, see how great this man is? Abraham is massive. He is the father of the faith. And yet, the author shows he's not better than Melchizedek. Melchizedek is actually greater than him. And so in verse 9, one might even say that Levi himself, who receives tithes from the people, paid tithes through Abraham, for he was still in the loins of his ancestor when Melchizedek met him. Do you see how this author, he just kind of continues to drill down even deeper and deeper? He's like, you know what? Abraham, right? Great man. Melchizedek is better. And so if Melchizedek is greater than Abraham, what's also true? Ipso facto true. It means he says he's also greater than the Levites. Why is he greater than the Levites? Why is he greater than Levi? Because Levi comes from Abraham. Isn't that an interesting argument, right? He says he was still in the loins of his ancestor. That's a strange way of saying it. He uses a seminal argument, right? Levi was is in the seed of Abraham. And so the point is, if it's not clear, the point is that the author's saying, yes, Melchizedek is greater than Abraham. And yes, Melchizedek then is greater than Levi because Levi comes from Abraham. The Melchizedekian priesthood is greater. It's greater. I hope you're following. So are you following the logic and the rational? This is why he says, I want to teach you about Melchizedek, but it's hard because you're still on milk. You're still babies. And I want you to grow up in the faith. In verses 1-3, he says, Melchizedek is just a shadow. He's just a type. He's just a little figurine pointing to someone who is coming. And in verses 4 to 10, he's saying, see how great this guy is. He's superior. Because the lesser will be blessed by the greater. Now here's another question. Then why do we need a Melchizedekian priest though? Why is this really all that important? That's like, ooh, great, that's interesting, that's fascinating. But why is that needed? Well, why do we need that rather than why can't we just continue on with the Levitical priests, the priests that come from Levi? Well, the author is going to tell us why we need this Melchizedekian high priest. Look at verse 11. Now if perfection, feel free to circle that in your companion guides. Now if perfection or completeness had been attainable through the Levitical priesthood, what further need would there be to have been another priest to rise after in the order of Melchizedek? Right, that's the point. He's like the reason that we need it because the Levitical priesthood doesn't complete or perfect anybody. No one is actually made complete, and no one is actually made perfect through the Levitical priesthood. You're not going to be made right with God through all these animal sacrifices. You need a greater priest and a greater priesthood. The reason that we need this Melchizedekian priest is because we need a change. A change is needed. And a change is needed because something is broken. Something's off. We need perfection. We need perfection. And guess what? The law in the Old Testament and the priesthood could not accomplish this. Couldn't be made complete. And you couldn't be made perfect. It did not perfect a person. You're going to see that. You saw it already in verse 11, and you're going to see it further described in the rest of the chapter. We need a change. And so in verse 12, you see it? For when there is a change in the priesthood, there is necessarily a change in the law as well. Whoa, wait a second. That's an interesting verse. You're like, it doesn't sound that interesting. It's interesting, trust me. Right? He says, when there's a change in the priesthood, there's a change in the law. Not in the priest, because priests in the Levitical priest, they would die and another one would raise up. And they would die and another one would raise up. They're not perpetual or forever like a Melchizedekian priest. But he's saying, if there's a change in the priesthood, that office, there is necessarily now a change in the law, in the system, in the economy, right? So that's not real helpful. So let me try to get at it maybe in a more helpful way. For those of you who are sports fan, all right? You don't even have to be a sports fan to even understand this though, right? When you change a head coach, you change the system. When there's a change in the coach or in the leadership, guess what changes as well? The system changes. How many of you watched the game yesterday? There was a game, some of you don't even want to talk about the game, right? The Hawkeyes versus the Buckeyes. And I can guarantee you, some of you are watching that Iowa game and you're like, man, we have a really good defense, but I wish we had an offense. Our offense stinks, right? And so, not advocating this, I'm just saying, if Kirk Ferentz gets canned, right? If there's a new coach, what are you likely going to see? You're going to see a change in the system. Iowa may someday have a high-flying offense. Somebody's like, you change the coach? You change the system. Someday, you might not have t-shirts that say, punting is winning. Right? A new coach brings a new system. A new leadership brings a new economy, a new culture, a new system. That's what's being described here. You change the priesthood, you change the economy, right? Why do you need a change? Why do you need a change? That's what the author is talking about. We saw it alluded to in verse 11, but now verse 18. Verse 18 tells us why when you change the priesthood, you change the system. Why is that needed? For on the one hand, a former commandment is set aside because of its weakness and uselessness. Why is a change needed? Because it's weak and it's useless. Whew. That's borderline blasphemous. Can you imagine? He's saying the law, the priesthood, useless, weak, right? But he's going to explain, like, why can he say that? Because that is stark, that is harsh. And so he'll go on to explain, this is what he means by how the law, the priesthood, why he explains why it's weak, right? Verse 19, for the law made nothing perfect, yet again. It can't perfect anybody. But on the other hand, a better hope is introduced, through which we draw near to God. The law and the priesthood in the Old Testament could not perfect anybody, right? It didn't complete anyone. That's why the priest and the sacrifices could not perfect a person. It didn't fix the problem. It did not fix the problem. So why do we need a new priest? You're starting to see the author explain why. Why do we need a Melchizedekian priest? Right? The law can't save. That's why. It can't perfect. That's why you look in Romans chapter 10, what does Paul say? Christ is the end of the law for all who believe. He is our perfect priest. In fact, the law always just showed that you would always fall short. The law was great at showing us that you are broken. There is an author that many of you have heard before. His name is John Bunyan. And he said something really, I think, helpful when it came to the law and to the good news of better hope, the gospel. He said, he wrote it this way: run, John, run, the law demands, which it does, but gives you neither feet nor hands. That's the law. Run, Jay, run, but I'm not giving you feet nor hands. Far better news the gospel brings. It bids us fly. Can we do that? Nope. But gives you wings. It does for you what you can't do for yourself. And so we see now, he's starting to introduce, like, right, the old, useless, and weak. It's not my words. That's the author's words. But why? Because of better hope. Jesus gives us a better hope, a greater hope that is safe and secure. Look at this. Here's the better hope. Verse 20. And it is not without an oath, right? It's not without a promise. For those who formerly became priests were made such without an oath. They didn't make an oath. But this one was made by a priest with an oath, by one who said to him, the Lord has sworn and will not change his mind. You are a priest forever. In other words, it's like, well, I think what the author is claiming is like, well, how do we know that there's not going to be another change in the economy? Right? You're saying that, okay, this priest, you change the priesthood, you change the system, you change the law. Well, all of a sudden we have a new priest, right? A new priesthood, the Melchizedekian priesthood, and now you change the law. Well, what's to say that we're not going to have another priesthood come around? Then changing, therefore, the security and the hope that we have. And the author says, that won't happen. You know why? Because there's an oath. he has made an oath. There is a promise. This is forever. It is a perpetual promise. A promise that will not end. Jesus is always going to be our final priest and our final sacrifice. Now that's coming. Chapters 8, 9, and 10 will talk about just that. Verse 22 is where the hope comes. This makes Jesus the guarantor of a better covenant. We have a greater covenant, folks, made by a greater priest. So now, I put this in my notes. I hope that it's helpful. He talks about how the law was useless or weak, but he explains it. That doesn't mean that the law of God was bad. In fact, Paul tells us, elsewhere, even in the New Testament, we see that the Old Testament is good. In fact, it's wholly righteous and good. What's weak is not the law. What's weak? Us. We're weak. Maybe a better way of describing the weakness and the uselessness is and I'll explain it even more next week, is like, have you ever gone into like Costco or Sam's and you see like in the back, you see all those I guess chickens that are like, they have like a big rod going through, it's called a spit, and then then the chickens keep turning and turning and turning, and it's like, oh, that looks so good, right? Have you ever imagine now, like putting a roast like in a crock pot. Ever done a roast in a crock pot? And then imagine trying to stick like one of those like spits through a roast. And when you lift that roast out of a crock pot that's been in there for like, I don't know, say 7-8 hours, what's gonna happen to that roast? It's gonna fall right off. Is it the spit's problem? It's not the rod's problem. The rod is perfect. It does exactly what it's meant to do. What's the problem? It's the roast. It's weak, right? The spit is willing and the flesh is weak, right? It just will fall right off. So that's what it's like. That's the point. The law is holy, righteous, and good. What's weak is us. We're the problem. And so he fixes the problem. Now in verses 23, you see like former priests were many in numbers, and they were prevented by death to continue on. There was no perpetual priesthood, right? Aaron died. He gives it to Nadab and Abihu, his sons. Guess what? They die. And then he gives it on, and they give it to like Eli later on. And then Eli has sons, and he dies, and then Hophni and Phinehas, and they die. And some of these priests are good, and some of these priests are not good. But in verse 24, but he, meaning Jesus, he holds his priesthood permanently because he continues forever. He is a perpetual priest. He holds his priesthood in perpetuity. He holds it forever and ever and ever. And so are we secure? Are we secure? Well, yes, we are, because in verse 25, consequently, he is able to save to what? To the uttermost. That's how safe and secure we are. We are safe and secure to the uttermost. And in verse 26, what do we see? This priest, he's not like some of the other priests. He is holy and innocent and unstained, separated from sinners and exalted above the heavens. Right? He's not like the other priests, those high priests who offer sacrifices daily for their own sins and for the sins of the people. Since he himself offered up, what did he offer up? He offered up himself. He is our perfect high priest. So, there will be no other system. He is our permanent priest forever and ever. And so, it's a perfect system, and sacrifice never to be approved on because of an oath and because it was performed by the very Son of God. And so that's good news for us. If you're here today and you're wondering like, man, I have just made a wreck of things. You have. and I have. And that's the good news of the gospel, is that God does for us what we cannot do for ourselves. He has saved us. He has saved us. And he is always interceding. He stands in the gap forever. So if you're here today and you've never trusted Jesus, the one who forgives sins, the one who cleanses, the ones who credits actually his perfection and his righteousness to you because he lived a perfect life, right? That is how we have peace. And he will continue. He has made an oath. He will be our priest forever and forever to intercede. So, would you pray with me? Father in heaven, thank you for your son. Thank you that you, even when we were rebels, you demonstrate your love towards us while sending Jesus on our behalf, that we might have forgiveness and life. If there is anyone here, God, I pray, Spirit of God, awaken hearts that they would respond to him. God, if there's anyone here struggling to understand the depths of your love and your care, I pray that they would understand how wide and long and high and deep your love is for us. God, I pray that they would look to you, knowing that you still intercede, faithfully intercede on our behalf. You are our forever, permanent high priest. And for that, we love you and we honor you. And all God's people said, amen.